I know it's July right now, but I'm feeling spooky, so we're gonna do Halloween in July with a video about a spooky game each week. Remember when Slender Man was the coolest thing around and everyone was scrambling to do something related to him in order to get that sweet 11 to 15 Hot Topic money? I do. Remember how some random Unity engine freeware game, starring everyone's favorite something awful counterpart to the SCP Foundation, saved the survival horror genre? I do. Remember how there was a standalone sequel/spiritual successor to that game that ended up being a crappy cash-in in the very genre it helped re-establish? I do. Slender The 8 Pages, or more commonly known as Slender across the endless videos about people playing and overreacting to the game, was that game. You get chased by the bad man, and if you win, you might get a Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged reference depending on if you were able to download the game before the copyright dispute or not. Slender seemingly came from out of nowhere. I remember hearing nothing about it from all the games media sources I followed before seeing clips of it on YouTube, which surprised me, as at the time I felt like I was pretty in the know about things concerning video games. Like any other group of high school kids at the time, we all got into a dark room together and took turns trying to get all 8 pages and getting the crap scared out of us whenever the Slender Man would just come out of nowhere and get us. The original Slender had that trifecta that let it break into the mainstream where audiences outside of gaming would want to get in on it. It was easy to figure out how to play. It was fun by yourself, but even more fun with a group of people, and most importantly, it was free. You didn't have to go and put down money on something that you weren't sure if you were going to like or not, so there was no risk in trying the game. Slender was built on the at time very little known and seldom used Unity engine. Unity had been around since 2005, but it wasn't in heavy use until the 3.0 update, which gave it desktop and browser functionality. Before that, there was maybe a couple dozen games built on it from 2005 to late 2011. This update made Unity go from having a small handful of games to a veritable explosion of indie titles, one of which was Slender The 8 Pages. Now, I'm not sure, but I think there might be a chicken's egg scenario here in regards to if Slender was the start of Unity's popularity among indie devs, or if it was Unity's popularity that created Slender. Unity was always open for anyone to use, but after Slender came out in mid-2012, the Unity scene blew up in subsequent years. Just look at the Wikipedia listing of here are all the games made with Unity. This is a rabbit hole we can loop around in forever, but let's talk about other significant things in regards to Slender. Something we have to thank Slender for, other than the onslaught of copycat games using the Unity engine polluting YouTube, and the cutesyification of one of the first internet-based folklore characters, is that Slender was instrumental in popularizing YouTube gaming to a mainstream audience. Before Slender, most YouTube gaming content was made by gamers for gamers. Case in point, Oxhorn's old WoW videos, the YouTube arms race between Total Biscuit, God rest his soul, and Jesse Cox for Cataclysm content, and walkthroughs before you slapped your awkward commentary over them and called it a Let's Play. Aside from maybe the Leroy Jenkins clip, you were likely only looking for gaming content on YouTube if you were already way into video games. Gaming channels did exist and were even doing pretty well within the sphere of gaming on YouTube, but it never really got past people looking for gaming-related videos already. While Amnesia: The Dark Descent was the start of gaming videos leaking into the mainstream, Slender and its accessibility helped gaming content become more widely accepted. The accessibility and simplicity of Slender really helped get things going in the early 2010s and ushered in a whole new generation of YouTubers to overreact at the camera for millions and millions of views, while helping to revitalize horror games at that. I'm not kidding about that last bit. Slender The 8 Pages really did bring about a revolution in horror games. In the late 90s and early 2000s, horror games often had you playing as a competent character faced with a situation that pushed them to their absolute limits, where they were only able to barely escape with their lives thanks to the player's intervention. As we got further on into the 2000s, horror game protagonists got more and more competent as graphics got better, allowing for more large, elaborate zombie annihilating set pieces. With Resident Evil's 4 to 6, the Dead Space franchise, and even that Call of Cthulhu game that came out around the time, eventually boiling down to the protagonist being a hyper-competent super commando type, backflipping through hordes of enemies and repairing everything in the sight to their advantage. You can see how poorly this went over with fans, as the reviews for each of these subsequent games in these franchises got lower with each title, with Resident Evil 6 and Dead Space 3 getting the lowest scores of their franchise in recent history, thanks to them doing the same old thing in a post-Slender world. People were tired of horror being super commandos mowing through zombies. It was more like thriller games than horror games. Slender and the subsequent copycat games brought something fresh to the face of horror games, who were currently sporting big muscular protagonists that have multiple machine guns in their inventory. Slender featured a totally helpless protagonist, whose only weapon was a near useless flashlight, and they could maybe run for about 20 or 30 meters before getting winded and having to walk for the rest of the game. You can't kill the monster in this horror game either. You can get him off your back, maybe temporarily if you run fast enough, but you can't subdue him, and if anything, the Slender Man's just gonna want to get you more if you continue to persevere. There's no escaping this guy, there is no stopping this guy. Once you pick up that first page, the hunt is on. You can't fight a supernatural being, let alone outrun him, because he straight up teleports right behind you. And you're possibly suffering from late stage COPD, or maybe you're a longtime asthmatic in this game, but the protagonist of Slender The 8 Pages is not exactly a star athlete. You just need to get those 8 pages because reasons. And they're put in places where you're going to have to put yourself in situations where the Slender Man can and will corner you. I hope you save your sprinting for that public bathroom looking place. This was likely easier in development because all the copycats did it too, which resulted in horror games taking a turn for monsters that were actually a threat to the protagonist and protagonists who didn't have special forces training. Horror games had some horror in them again. A good parallel to where pre-Slender horror games were going would be if Nightmare on Elm Street had a bunch of special forces psyops with mental conditioning to specifically resist Freddy instead of a bunch of teenagers looking to party. When the good guys and protagonists have abilities to easily take out the thing that's supposed to be terrorizing them, it just doesn't make for good horror. And double down if suddenly the thing that is pursuing you, there's like 1,000 of them instead of just one big scary one. It takes away the uniqueness of the situation. Another thing that really helps Slender bring about a second win for horror games is that it's short, sweet, and to the point. Slender is a game that can be done inside of 20 minutes if you're fast. Its controls and objectives are easy to understand. WASD to move, click to get the pages, and hold shift to run until your bad life choices with smoking catch up with you. You also get a flashlight with maybe a minute of battery life because only suckers are prepared enough to check their batteries in their emergency kit regularly. If the bad guy gets too close to you and you look at him, the screen gets all fuzzy until you get some special FaceTime with the Slender Man and you die, I guess. Try again. The best part is that it's just as fun to watch as it is to play. This not only helped with that YouTube scene, but for the time it was like a free version of a Ouija board that wasn't played out to death. Once you've played, you'll likely look into getting it for yourself and you'll see that it's free. You download it and look at that, now you're playing it in a dark room with some other friends and the freak out cycle continues. Occasionally, somebody or a group of people will upload their crazy reactions to YouTube, and those get shared around among normies that want to see people freak out. I personally remember, in addition to like the usual suspects that were up and coming at the time, that like, I think it was like 11 drunk guys play Slender. That one was a classic. Now, take all that revolutionizing and fun and playability and throw it right in the trash. On the heels of Slender, The 8 Pages were an insane amount of copycat games made in Unity Engine, featuring a similar type of gameplay, save for not having a recognizable antagonist or anything that draws the player to the game aside from being YouTube bait. Well, there was one that had a recognizable character, Slender The Arrival. How can a full release version of the original game be considered a copycat of the thing it was based on? Well, for starters, it's still less than an hour long, but adds very little content to the game it's based on. Also, all the achievements are 2009 era rage face memes in 2013, around the time that Hot Topic was starting to sell t-shirts with rage faces on them so that normies can feel special too. This detracts from the net value of Slender The Arrival, and it's nowhere near enough to justify adding a price tag to a free video game. It seemed promising enough at first. They got the team behind Marble Hornets to help write the story, so it was being handled by people who knew about the Slender Man mythos, and up to a point, arguably contributed to it. I'm not sure if this was a Kickstarter or not, too, because at the end credits they mentioned backers, but there's no trace for any crowdfunding for this game. Perhaps this is in reference to the people that bought the game before it got on Steam, because At around this time, it was a big deal for an indie title to get on Steam's store page, and Steam Greenlight had just became a thing, and back then they were extremely stingy with what games got greenlit when the service first came out. Aside from this and getting the original creator of Slender the 8 Pages on board, there isn't really all that much about the game's development. You can buy this game for $1 now, but I don't think it was worth $10 that they were initially asking for in 2013 money. This game is short, like really short for a paid game. There's an achievement for beating this game in under 45 minutes, and it can be conceivably done in half an hour or less. It's basically the same thing as the free game, except there's a plot loosely connecting the levels together, and each level is near identical in scope. You're just going to different things and interacting with them in a similar way, while the Slender Man and or his proxy either pursue you or forget about you because they remember that somebody else owes the Slender Man $20. The devs did come out and say they intended for Slender The Arrival to be much easier than the original game, but the only time I ever really got caught by the Slender Man or Hot Topic kid was when I hadn't quite figured out the layout of a level or it was intentionally part of the story. Speaking of the story, it's pretty forgettable. Some girl is investigating the disappearance of some other girl who is investigating the disappearance of some guy who is in turn investigating the disappearance of a child. This isn't particularly convoluted. As you're playing it, it will feel like they're just copy and pasting the same story elements over and over again to try and fill maybe 2 hours of playtime if the player's incompetent like me. Along the way, you'll be harassed by the Slender Man and his current proxy, some kid he adopted from a Hot Topic. The proxy isn't even all that scary. It's easily frightened by bright lights, and you get a free pass the first time it gets you. It just makes this loud squee noise before performing a maneuver called glomping, which incapacitates you for a moment by violating your personal space. Glomping is usually used by a subtype of teenager called a seenie weenie to initiate physical contact with people they're attracted to who have repeatedly told them that they are not interested in them romantically. After performing the glomping maneuver, it turns away to make sure that their mom doesn't try and delete all their Invader Zim reruns off the family DVR. So you get a break. Don't worry though, they'll be back in a moment once they've had a chance to replenish and reapply their manic panic hair dye. This game concludes with an oh-so-spooky run through the forest with some very convincing fire effects as you race to a radio tower to learn the secret of escaping the Slender Man. Spoiler alert, you have to die. Congratulations, you just paid $10 for a free video game. Slender The Arrival isn't without promising characteristics though. The music and general ambience in this game are pretty good in a number of places. The music alone is scarier than the Slender Man in this game, and come to think of it, I think they might have just recycled the same model from the original game for Slender The Arrival. Coupled with the use of dark, cramped environments, this game can create some serious tension, which is all ruined as soon as the Slender Man shows up. And also, while it's barely used in the game itself, I really like the dynamic between the Slender Man and the proxy, where you can't look at the Slender Man in order to elude them, however, you have to look at the proxy in order to elude that. And it creates this nice pincer dynamic where you have to constantly be balancing between the two, and if you're playing on harder difficulties, they will gang up on you. This game has its moments, but it's not enough to make the game worth any money. If you haven't figured this out yet, this game got panned pretty hard by critics, and at the time the only people that really consumed it were Slender Man super friends and clout-hungry YouTubers. The funny, or perhaps ironic thing is that in all of this, Slender The Arrival was a stale, uninspired entry into the very genre the original game helped save from the brink of death. Blue Isle, the studio that made Slender The Arrival, did have a couple other games that were much better received than Slender, but perhaps didn't quite get the press coverage that they deserve thanks to not being centered around a popular internet mythology character. You can get this game and all the rage face meme achievements it has for 99 cents now, but remember, this is basically a paid extension of a free game. And whatever, it costs less than a soda from the vending machine. If it helps you make up your mind on paying the money for this, there are no teens from Hot Topic doing voice acting inside of a can of Dr. Pepper. Slendermania inspired not one, but two movies about the titular character that tried to piggyback off the fame of this internet sensation. There was the one that we all heard about because those kids straight up tried to murder someone, so the studio making it had to try and defang it for safety purposes, at the cost of making the movie even worse than it probably was before all the damage control. But there was also one that was based off the Marvel Hornets series. Neither of them are really worth your time unless you're really into everything Slender Man, but if you're that into it, you've probably already seen them both and you were likely disappointed by that. Something that's worthy of noting before we close out the video here is that the original version of Slender the 8 Pages never made it to 1.0. It got as high as version 0.97, and then Slender The Arrival came along. Maybe Slender The Arrival was meant to be the 1.0 version of Slender the 8 Pages. However, I don't know. If this is going to be the full version of Slender, I'm not feeling it. I personally would have much rather had a fully realized version of the Slender Source project that was coming around, or anything else. I just feel like Slender the Arrival is half-baked and not quite deserving of being the spiritual successor. But that's just me. Let me know what you think in the comments. Ironically, Slender the 8 Pages spawned God knows how many copycats that its own sequel and or successor, depending on how you see it, got caught up in. The game that started a revolution in the survival horror genre also ended up being a tired entry into that genre. That's it for today. Special thanks to all my patrons. If you want to help me make more of these videos, be sure to check out my Patreon, which I regularly update with little snippets of what I'm working on every week, and maybe spend that dollar helping me out instead of being disappointed at Slender The Arrival. Stay tuned for the rest of Halloween in July by subscribing. Now then, sign-offs are stupid and I don't really know how to do them. Bye. Better not be murderers out here. Cool.
Alright, well, it's these.
This is your required cat quota. Now we say we can... Now we can say that we own... Oh, now you're entertained. Except no, you're just annoyed. Yeah, that's annoying too. Let's turn it off. Alright, go stare down the other cat. Something we have to thank Slender the 8 Pages for, other than the onslaught of copycat games polluting YouTube, and the cutesyification of one of the first internet-based folklore figures. Hey, cat! If you want to be in the video, if you want to be in the room while Daddy's recording, you have to stay in the room. I can't just be letting you go in and out. You understand that? Don't just look at me, nod, and understand. Show acknowledgement of understanding, please.